every act of violence that takes place, whether it's a shooting of a public figure or an attack on a religious institution, every one of those acts of violence shows people the possibilities.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. Recently, there was another shooting at a religious institution in the United States. A gunman killed 4 people and wounded 8 at a Latter-day Saints or Mormon church in Michigan. President Trump described this as yet another targeted attack on Christians in the United States of America. But there are distinct differences between this and other high-profile shootings. How is this similar to or different from other attacks on religious institutions in America? What are the motivations behind these attacks? And is there a through line between the assassination of Charlie Kirk and this attack on an LDS church in Michigan? To discuss these questions, I'm glad to welcome Associate Professor David Smith back on the program. He teaches American politics and foreign policy here at the USSC, and he's one of Australia's leading experts on religious persecution in America. He is an author of Religious Persecution and Political Order in the United States, and recently wrote an op-ed for The Conversation titled "The Michigan Church Shooting Sits Within a Long History of Hatred Against Mormons in America." And I just found out that article it was picked up and run in both Michigan and Utah in the United States as well. So I would definitely encourage you to check them out. Both are good reads. So thanks so much for joining me today, David.
Thanks for having me.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get you by the numbers stat. You're good to go on that?
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. So to kick things off, can you tell us, I guess, what do we know about the shooting at the LDS Church in Michigan? The shooter was killed at the scene.
Yes.
But do we know anything about his motive or what led to this?
So even though the police who are investigating have not officially named a motive, there have been plenty of statements both from government officials and media reporting that indicate that he was motivated by quite a strong hatred of Mormons. So Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has said this. Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, has also said this. And there have been media interviews both with acquaintances of his and with people who only knew him in passing that said that he talked about Mormons in this very hostile way quite a lot. So a member of the Burton City Council who had been canvassing the week before said he knocked on this guy's door and he immediately launched into this anti-Mormon conspiracist spiel. And people who know him say that he spent a few years in Utah where he was struggling with substance abuse problems, and he had a relationship with a Latter-day Saint woman which fell apart, and they believe that this gave him this hostility towards Mormons. And they say that he referred to Mormons as the Antichrist, said that they were trying to take over the world, was obsessed with the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. So it sounds like he had these quite personal reasons for his hatred of Mormons. But at the same time, the kind of language that he was using taps into this very deep strain of conspiracist thinking about Mormons that has been around ever since the church was founded in 1830.
And President Trump compared this to other attacks on Christians in America. He spoke out very quickly, and then he kind of went quiet afterwards. Was this similar to other attacks on Christians, like the shooting at a Catholic school in Minnesota recently? Well,
so the language that Trump used, saying this is yet another targeted attack on Christians, that fits Trump's culture war framing of things. So ever since he first ran for president in 2016, Trump has been claiming that Christians are relentlessly under attack in the United States and that they need him to defend them. So that very much fit his framing of things. But that ignores the fact that there's this very specific history of hatred against Mormons in the United States, which in many cases comes from other Christians who don't believe that Mormons are Christians.
Oh.
They believe that Mormons are something else masquerading as Christians, and they really fear that Mormonism, which is a very fast-growing religion, is going to take true Christians and turn them away from the path of Christianity. So calling this a targeted attack on Christians, I think, really missed what was actually going on here. A lot of the attacks in religious institutions in the United States, they're not always motivated by hatred of that particular group, although there are plenty of instances in which they are. Sometimes, like the last shooting that took place in a Mormon house of worship was in 2018. That was one Mormon killing another Mormon who he had some dispute with. And some of the worst shootings that have taken place in houses of worship seem to have been committed by people who had some kind of personal problem with the institution. And that seems to have been what happened at that shooting in a Catholic church, at a Catholic school a few weeks ago. But there are other instances of attacks which are very clearly motivated by hatred of that religion. So the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue back in, I think it was 2018, that was motivated by somebody who believed that Jews had organized this conspiracy to replace white people in America with non-white immigrants. And I think that in many cases, hatred of a religious group gets particularly dangerous when there's a conspiracy theory involved. And conspiracy theories often involve groups that are relatively numerically small, such as Jews, such as Muslims in the United States, who are less than 1% of the population, or such as Mormons. And it's this belief that this numerically small group nonetheless wields a lot of power, exercises a lot of power behind the scenes, and has ambitions to take over the country or even take over the world and to control everything. There's a Muslim scholar called Zia el-Ibrahimi he described this as conspiratorial racialization and said this is one of the things that anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment often have in common. It's this belief that this group is trying to take over the country or trying to take over the world, no matter how small their numbers seem to be in that country. And you do get a similar thing historically directed towards Mormons in the United States. And that began with the foundation of the church all the way back in 1830, because Joseph Smith gathered a lot of followers very quickly. Often relations with their neighbors were quite tense. People would fear the political power of these Mormons who would move to a county and would become a numerical majority in the county. And certainly there are a lot of people who believe that despite their seemingly small numbers, that the ambitions of the Church of Latter-day Saints are to take over the country or to take over the world. And that appears to have been one of the things that motivated this gunman. So that kind of conspiracy theorizing about religious minorities is where it gets really dangerous. Now, there is also a lot of animus towards evangelical Christians in the United States, and a lot of that does come from liberals. But that is often something quite different. That's more to do with just the way that the culture wars break down in the United States, where basically religious conservatives are seen as being on one side, secular liberals are seen as being on the other side, and both of them believe that the other side is trying to impose their values on the country. And so you get this sort of mirror image of secular, real distrust of evangelical Christians, and evangelical Christians really thinking that secularists are out to get them. But the difference is that culture war takes place through politics that is all pretty much out in the open. You can see it happening everywhere. In fact, it's it's one of the things that structures American party politics at the moment. Conspiracy theories that target groups like Jews and Mormons, they hold that everything is happening behind the scenes, and that what justifies this kind of violence is this unaccountable power that is being exercised somewhere. So that's what makes that animus particularly dangerous.
And it's interesting because you mentioned this a bit, but that Mormons themselves are part of the persecution sometimes comes from the Christian community, the ones that, President Trump is saying that this attack on the Mormon church is an attack on Christianity.
Yeah.
But Christians themselves are often the ones kind of anti-Mormon.
Yes.
So, I mean, does that contribute to this persecution that we see? Because you cover, Mormons, their history extensively in your book, and they were subject to quite a lot of religious persecution in America. Ironically, this country that's founded for, liberty and freedom, and especially religious liberty. But why do you think that Mormons have been and continue to be targeted so often?
Yeah, well, there's a few things going on. One is this idea that they're pretending to be Christians, but they're really not. Now, Mormons regard themselves as Christians. I would refer to them as restorationist Christians. But there are very significant differences between Latter-day Saints theology and mainstream Christian theology in terms of Mormons have another scripture which they regard as equal in authority to the Bible. They believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and their understanding of the whole relationship between humanity and God is quite different. But there are many Christians who do not accept Mormons as Christians, and I did survey research on this about a decade ago. I found overall about half of Americans believe Mormons are Christians and half do not. But people who themselves identify more strongly as Christians are less likely to say that Mormons are Christians. And this is another thing that can really generate violence, the belief that some group is pretending to be something else when it's not. During the Spanish Inquisition, the most violent phases of that were directed actually at Jewish converts to Catholicism, some cases more than 3 generations down the line, who were still suspected of secretly carrying out Jewish practices.
Wow.
So that's something that historically really motivates violence, that someone who is pretending to be something that they're not is not to be trusted at all and is not to be given the same rights as other people. In the contemporary context, also, secular-minded liberals often really distrust Mormons. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that in the late 2000s, the Latter-day Saints Church was a very effective campaigner against same-sex marriage. So Proposition 8 in California, this is 2008. This is the year that Obama got elected.
Yeah, and I was in California when Prop 8 was getting voted on. It was an interesting time.
So this, by then, Deep Blue State, which voted overwhelmingly for Obama, also voted to ban same-sex marriage. And the LDS Church largely got blamed for that by liberals because they organized the campaign so effectively. And so there was a period where there were a lot of protests outside LDS houses of worship and some instances of arson and vandalism as well. And then Mitt Romney became the Republican candidate for president in 2012. I looked at survey data from 2008, which asked, would you ever vote for a Mormon as president? And then I looked at it again in 2012. Not surprisingly, the number of liberals who said they would never vote for a Mormon as president jumped through the roof during that period. This is despite the fact that Harry Reid, who was the Democratic Senate Majority Leader at the time, was also a Mormon. But yeah, Mitt Romney really shaped people's perceptions of it. So there is quite a lot of liberal hostility towards LDS people, and that has occasionally manifested itself in terms of destruction of church property. More often, though, it takes the form of things like the Book of Mormon musical. So it more often takes the form of mockery. And the Book of Mormon musical is an interesting thing. It was written by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two people who grew up in Colorado, where there are quite a lot of LDS people who they would have known, and there's quite a lot of insider humor in that. And even though there are parts of it that a lot of LDS people find offensive, first of all, I think it's probably far more offensive to Ugandans. But
I haven't seen it.
but second, those who have seen it will know what I'm talking about. But second, there were other LDS people who saw this and thought, this isn't that bad at all. We could potentially use this as a promotional tool. So there were some theaters where LDS people would distribute leaflets around saying, you've seen the musical of the Book of Mormon. How about you come and investigate the book? Because the majority of LDS characters in that musical are actually portrayed very positively, even if there's a bit of mockery going on. And these days, one of the stereotypes of Mormons, because this was another thing that I looked into in survey research, is that they're overwhelmingly friendly and nice. Now, that is not what the stereotype was of Mormons 100 or 150 years ago. The stereotype was they are violent. They are violent frontier people who will fight back if you try to, fight them. And in 1857, when the United States government launched an ill-fated war against the Mormons in Utah, the United States Army never actually made it all the way to Utah because it was a long way away. But one of the things that happened in that conflict was that there was a wagon train of migrants going from Arkansas to California who were attacked by a Mormon militia. And I think there was more than 200 people died in that massacre. That was known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And earlier this year, there was a Netflix series about that called American Primeval. There was also a streaming series a few years ago based on John Krakauer's book, Under the Banner of Heaven. Now, that book, which was a bestseller in 2003, and which I think for a religion that is not that well known, a lot of people's first contact with Mormon history would have been through this book, which it's discussing murders that happened in an LDS splinter sect in the 1980s, but it kind of links it all back to this very violent history of the early LDS church, which was mainly violence that was perpetrated against Mormons, but also violence perpetrated by Mormons in some instances. So even though there's now this overwhelming stereotype of Mormons as really friendly and hardworking, which is a stereotype that works in their favor sometimes, the violence has never quite been forgotten either.
It's interesting because as you're describing that, I recently was listening to audiobooks to help me fall asleep, and I was like, let's do the Sherlock Holmes stories because there's a lot of them. It'll last me a long time. Let's do that. And the first one, I'd read it when I was in year 6 or something, so I'd totally forgotten it. But I was shocked by the role that Mormons play in this, Sherlock Holmes story, which you think it wouldn't because it takes place in the UK.
Yeah.
But the portrayal of Mormons in that was quite violent.
Yes.
There was a lot of violence involved in that. And I remember being a bit taken aback and surprised and shocked by that. But I guess in the historical context, if this was written in the late 1800s, and then maybe that fits more with that portrayal of Mormons.
Absolutely,
at that time.
yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's very fascinating. But it's interesting because in the U.S., well, not just the U.S., but largely in the U.S. right now, it's not just the LDS church shooting or the Catholic school shooting. There have been a number of religious attacks recently, including at synagogues and mosques. Have there been more attacks linked with religion recently, or are we just noticing it more now?
We may be noticing it more now, but in general, hate crime has been increasing in the United States.
What could be driving that?
I am not sure. One of my worst fears about this is that there's a lot of copycatting going on. Every act of violence that takes place, whether it's a shooting of a public figure or an attack on a religious institution, every one of those acts of violence shows people the possibilities of it happening. Yeah. Shows people who might be violently minded themselves it establishes a repertoire of violence. And certainly in the case of the shooting of public figures, I was reading an interview with one of Charlie Kirk's former security detail after he was shot, who pointed out, in terms of shootings that take place from hundreds of feet away, he said only the president has protection against that. Basically, nobody else. It's almost impossible to guard against. No society can become such a fortress that it can prevent acts of violence in places that are very heavily armed. In a shooting that took place in a Southern Baptist church that resulted in 26 deaths, there were armed security guards there who eventually put a stop to it. The idea that having security guards everywhere or just better security everywhere, good guys with guns countering bad guys with guns, it's just a fantasy. The attacker always has the advantage, and in so many of these killings, the attacker has no intention of living afterwards either. Yeah. So in a country that is this big and this heavily armed and has this many social tensions, which in some people are going to translate into murderous plans, it's just very difficult to stop this kind of violence. And when it happens, I think it just encourages more because it just extends the repertoire of violence. It shows people what is possible. And I think that these attacks that we've seen on religious institutions or in religious institutions are part of this broader pattern of violence, which, I mean, is often very attention-seeking. And what was unusual about the killing of Charlie Kirk is that even though there's still a lot we don't know about that, that's one of the rare instances where it appears the killer actually didn't want to get caught. Actually didn't want to be known, hadn't written a manifesto or anything. Whereas in most of these cases, the attackers just intend to die.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. You bring up the Charlie Kirk shooting, which we have to talk about, and it's such an interesting, I guess, time in America. Yeah. With the dynamics around, I guess, what led to that and what's happened since then. Following his death, I mean, religion has become a key theme. Yeah. I knew a bit about Charlie Kirk beforehand. I didn't think of religion as one of the top things, but from what I understand, yes, it was a Christian, and I guess got more vocal about his faith as time went on.
Yes.
But many pastors and political leaders say that his killing was an attack on Christianity. He's been described as a Christian martyr, and House Speaker Mike Johnson said that his movement was a ministry. So do you think there's a through line between Charlie Kirk's killing and some of these other religious attacks, or is it an outlier?
Well, attributing it to his Christianity and referring to him as a Christian martyr, this fits a pattern that you often see after the killing of Christians, which is to retroactively turn them into martyrs. Now, as you have pointed out, Charlie Kirk, he did not begin as a Christian activist. This was something he embraced more and more as he went on. But he was still primarily a political figure rather than a religious figure. And Mike Johnson can call what he was doing ministering, but before his death, no one really would have seen that as ministering. And in his debates that he did, he wasn't emphasizing Christianity in that. It was a political agenda that he was pushing rather than a religious one, even if it was linked to a religious agenda. But so often after the killings of Christian figures, you see this lens of martyrdom put on it. There was a very famous instance of this during the Columbine shootings in 1999 in Colorado, which at the time was completely shocking in terms of school shootings. Unfortunately, school shootings have only got bigger and more frequent since then. But at the time, 15 school children killed in Colorado, that was seen as a shocking event. And this entire myth developed out of that, of this one student who supposedly was asked, Cassie Bernal, by one of the shooters, "Are you a Christian?" And she said yes, and then was shot. And this was made into this real sort of cultural moment about Christian martyrdom. This school student who bravely was killed because of her Christianity. There was a book about this called "She Said Yes." The evidence that has emerged since then is, well, there's not really any evidence that that this happened, but nonetheless is a very, very powerful cultural moment at the time. One of the things that Trump constantly says is Christians are persecuted. He recently told the UN General Assembly that Christians are the most persecuted religious group on earth. This is something that Christian groups have been saying for a long time, often backed by data which is pretty dubious. So you often see this figure that 10 million Christians were killed for their faith in the 1990s. The way that this figure is usually calculated is by taking the overall death count of the Rwandan genocide and of the Congo Civil War and saying, well, all of the victims who died were Christians, therefore this is persecution of Christians. This is not what we would normally understand, though, as religious persecution, as someone actually being killed for their religion, religion being the primary motive for them being killed. There were a lot of other reasons for the violence in those conflicts. And I've looked a lot into data about relative levels of persecution around the world. Christians probably are the most persecuted group by virtue of being the biggest group and the group that is present in the most countries, which is where there is authoritarian control of religion going on. Christians are often one of the groups persecuted, but it's the way that this is often presented is quite misleading, to say the least. And I think that one of the things that has happened with Charlie Kirk is we've just got this very familiar lens again, that this very prominent evangelical Christian who was very open about his faith has been killed. Therefore, it's been painted as he was killed for his faith. That was supposedly the major motive of the attacker. As I said, we're still really waiting for it all to come out. Exactly what was motivating this attacker. We've heard the quote that he that he believed that Charlie Kirk was spreading hate and wanted to put a stop to it. We've heard that he was living with a trans partner, but we haven't, there's really not enough there at the moment to say that this is someone who was persecuting Charlie Kirk because he was a Christian or trying to put a stop to Charlie Kirk's Christian message. But of course, the way that this is being interpreted by a lot of Charlie Kirk's Christian followers is that this was a Christian message, and that if this was motivated by Charlie Kirk's anti-trans comments, well, that was completely consistent with his Christianity. Therefore, he has died for practicing his Christianity as he saw fit. But at the very least, there's a lot of ambiguity around the religious elements here. And I wouldn't refer to this as an act of religious persecution, although, once again, with a caveat, we really don't know yet about the shooter's motives. Much more might come out about this that might make that more of an element in this case. But certainly, we saw with Charlie Kirk's memorial service that it was this real fusion of religion and politics, which is becoming increasingly common on the right of the United States. And we saw this quite sort of telling moment of Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, saying in accordance with her Christianity that she forgives the killer. And that was a reminder of how ethically demanding Christianity can be, this demand that you love your enemy that comes from the teachings of Jesus. Now, many Christians will also point out that that's not all there is to Christianity, that Christianity also involves the execution of justice against wrongdoers, which includes everything up to the death penalty,
Oh.
which many Christians believe is justified by a passage of Romans, albeit that's as part of the justice system. You have Donald Trump afterwards saying that he disagreed with Charlie Kirk. He doesn't love his enemies. He hates his enemies.
Oh, he disagreed with his wife.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Now, on the one hand, that was a bit of a joke, and he said it as a bit of a joke, and it got laughs. On the other hand, that clearly is what Trump believes.
Yeah, it tracks.
Yeah, and so it was this quite sort of stark moment, but I think it's a very revealing one, which is that it's not that conservative Christians saw that and thought, yep, Trump's very familiar with the book of Romans. This is what he's citing. No, it's conservative Christians have always believed that the value of Trump is as a political leader, not as a religious exemplar. They don't see him as an exemplary Christian, and many of them feel this is a good thing to have in a political leader because Trump followed decades of evangelical Christians being sorely disappointed with presidents who were evangelicals like Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush, but also with their own leaders. And part of the problem was they felt their own leaders were too constrained by Christian morality. Their own leaders were too constrained by the injunction to love your enemy, to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So in other words, to submit to the system of secular government, and also to turn the other cheek when attacked. When Christians believe that they are completely under siege from this hostile secular culture in the United States, they want somebody who is going to fight back. And that is what Trump always promised them. There was this very important event at Liberty University in 2016 where Trump famously mangled the name of a book of the Bible, 2 Corinthians. He called it 2 Corinthians. And the media that was assembled said, look, this is evidence that Trump is scripturally illiterate. They didn't pay attention to the reaction he got later on in his speech where he said, I will fight for you because I'm not politically correct, which got a standing ovation from the Liberty University crowd. And those two events together, they basically showed they know that he is in many ways not a real Christian, but they know that he will fight for them, and he will fight for them unconstrained by Christian morality. He is prepared to do things that a genuine, believing, practicing Christian would not do. And many of them believe that that is what's required. And that's why Trump has often been named alongside biblical figures like King Cyrus, the pagan king who was chosen by God to save the Jews. He's been named as this figure, this imperfect figure who is used by God to execute God's plans.
And you talked a bit about the risk of copycatting happening with these sorts of, public assassinations and shootings, things like that, which is something I've been thinking about a fair bit after the Charlie Kirk shooting. One thing I find interesting, and I wonder if this will counteract that or not, I don't know how much rational thinking comes into it, but what has happened following the Charlie Kirk shooting seems to be what I imagine. We don't know the motives of the killer, but I imagine it'd be the opposite of what he'd want because, Charlie Kirk has been treated like a martyr and there have been people like, flocking in droves to sign up for the Turning Point, new chapters or signing up with it, things like that. Even people who were anti-Charlie Kirk and outspoken against him. Yes, there's a subset of people who are still, they've gone on TikTok and done whatever. But even some of the people who are anti-Charlie Kirk are more sympathetic now. And you had a number of, Democrats condemning the killing and things like that. So, and then it's also given carte blanche in some ways to Trump or Republicans to go after a whole bunch of, things. I mean, the whole free speech thing that happened with Jimmy Kimmel and a lot of things that have happened. So I wonder if these outcomes that have been kind of the ramifications of the shooting, if that would be a deterrent to copycats seeing, if I were successful in this, political assassination, it would lead to an outcome that's not what I want. Is that something you've looked at or thought about at all?
Yeah, it is something that I've thought about. I certainly think that this reason, assassination is often a bad political strategy. But the people who are carrying out these killings, they are not political strategists.
Yeah.
They are not leaders of disciplined movements.
Yeah.
When you look at guerrilla groups or terrorist groups that carry out assassinations, then normally there's a strategy behind what they're doing. It's a terrible strategy, but there's a strategic logic behind it. That's not going on in the cases of these killings. These killings are usually carried out by people acting alone, acting in isolation, and to the extent that they've got political motivations or a political belief system, they've often developed it themselves online rather than as part of some kind of disciplined group. So, look, I would like to say that people realize that political violence of this kind is really counterproductive, but I don't think that that's what's going on with the people who are carrying out these kinds of attacks. It's worth mentioning, this backlash effect where it was taboo for a while after Charlie Kirk's death to even mention some of the quite noxious things and positions that he said and that he held throughout his life. The thing that I found most ironic is a lot of conservatives compared him to Martin Luther King, who was someone that Charlie Kirk described as horrible. But certainly there was not only this kind of backlash, but we're now seeing a backlash to the backlash. That the idea of when Jimmy Kimmel gave this monologue that wasn't even talking about Charlie Kirk. It was talking about, he was saying that Republicans would try to score points off Charlie Kirk. That was enough to briefly get him fired. There was a massive backlash to that forced Disney to bring him back. They basically saw the money consequences were going to be worse from this. At the moment, we are seeing proposed legislation in places like Oklahoma to have these compulsory construction of Charlie Kirk memorials on university campuses in Oklahoma. Now, if that happens, that is also going to be counterproductive to the Charlie Kirk cause because students don't like that kind of compulsory, this is how you've got to feel about something. That was something that Charlie Kirk himself recognized. Yeah, he presented himself as this kind of edgy insurgent figure who was overthrowing liberal orthodoxy on campus. If the enforced orthodoxy on campus becomes conservatism, and if Charlie Kirk becomes the sort of driving icon of that, there's going to be a backlash against that as well. Yeah.
So I guess my last question before I get you by the numbers stat is just, what effect do you think these acts of violence will have on religious movements and politics and culture in America? I mean, we've talked about the initial backlash and the backlash to the backlash. Where do you think this is going in terms of what it might be shaping moving forward?
Religious groups themselves, I think, tend to be very resilient in the face of these kinds of attacks. So the LDS Church, you may have seen, there were LDS people who, within days of this killing, they were raising funds for the widow and son of the widow and child of the killer.
Oh my gosh!
They were saying, this is another family that's been bereaved by this, by the loss of the father. That really is the Christian ethos of loving your enemy, believing that the enemy, that the killer's family has to be taken care of. So these religious groups, I think, are very resilient in the face of this. But the overall effect that this has on society, though, I mean, I'm not saying that an attack in a religious institution is any worse than an attack in a school, but religious places of worship are supposed to be sanctuaries. Historically, that's what they've been. Historically, this is why criminals have often fled into them, because law enforcement wouldn't be able to follow them there. They're supposed to be these safe places. So in the context of such a religious society, this is one of the things that makes attacks in these places of worship so shocking. It's the idea that nowhere is safe, not places of worship, not schools, not shopping malls, not universities, not anywhere. And when there's a belief that nowhere is safe, unfortunately, in the United States, one of the things that this motivates is for people to acquire more and more weapons and to demand more and more weapons in public, even though this doesn't have the effect of reducing violence at all. It just contributes to the fear. Yeah. So it's certainly violence just begets more violence.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought.
Yep.
It'll be interesting to see where things go from here. I'd love to get your statistic for today. What by the number stat do you have?
Well, it's 487.
Okay.
And that is the number of homicides in places of worship in the United States between 2000 and 2024.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. 487.
487.
Wow. That is huge.
Yep.
Well, thank you for sharing that today and for going through a really challenging and difficult topic. I greatly appreciate it. As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, hosts the Asia Chessboard podcast, and I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from major live events, including our recent Sydney International Strategy Forum. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, David, thank you so much for joining me.